I saw my daughter and my little granddaughter sitting quietly in a crowded shelter. I was confused and asked, "Why aren't you living the house I bought for you?" She looked at me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "What house, Dad?" 3 days later, I confronted her husband, and everything fell apart. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. The cold and eerie, Pennsylvania was the kind that settled into your bones before you even stepped outside. It did not arrive with wind or drama. It simply sat there, heavy and gray, pressing down on the city like a lid on a pot. The sky above the church on Reed Street had turned the color of old newspaper. Snow dusted the sidewalks in thin, uneven lines, and the bare oak trees along the curb stood stiff and dark against the pale afternoon light. Raylan Pierce pulled his truck to the curb and cut the engine. He sat for a moment, both hands still on the wheel, looking at the church entrance. The building was old limestone, built in the 50s, with double wooden doors propped open despite the cold. A hand-lettered sign on a sandwich board read, "Community Shelter, open daily 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. Below that, in smaller letters, "All are welcome." He was not supposed to be here longer than 10 minutes. He had 2 boxes of old blankets in the truck bed, thick wool ones that had been sitting in his garage since his wife passed 3 years ago now. He had not had the heart to give them away back then. But this week, for a reason he could not quite name, he had loaded them into the truck and driven here. He climbed out. The cold hit him clean across the face. He pulled his coat collar up, grabbed the first box from the bed, and carried it through the doors. Inside, the shelter smelled like industrial soap, burnt coffee, and something warm and starchy, soup, probably from the big pots he could see on the folding tables near the back wall. The main hall was a large open room with mismatched chairs arranged in rough rows. Every seat was taken. Families sat together with their belongings at their feet. Older men in worn jackets held paper cups with both hands. Children moved between the chairs in that restless, uncertain way kids move when they do not quite understand where they are or why. A volunteer in a red vest took the box from Raylan at the door with a nod of thanks. He went back to the truck for the second box. When he came back inside and set it down on the check-in table, he turned to go. That was when he saw her. She was sitting near the far wall, alone at the end of a folding table. Her coat was a thin gray thing, the kind made for fall, not for a January afternoon in Erie. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot, and there were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of sleep would fix quickly. She looked like someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had simply run out of places to set it down. Beside her, pressed against her arm with her head tilted at that soft angle that only sleeping children manage, was a little girl. She could not have been more than 4. She had dark hair and small hands and wore a purple jacket with a broken zipper held shut by a safety pin. Raylan stopped moving. His chest went tight in a way he had not felt in years. Tess. The word came out quieter than he intended, more like a breath than a name. She looked up. For half a second, her face was blank, the automatic guard of someone who had learned to be careful before recognizing. Then she saw him, and everything in her cracked open at once. Her chin trembled. Her eyes filled fast. She pressed her lips together hard, the way she used to do when she was 12 years old, and try not to cry in front of people. She did not cry, but she looked at him like someone who had been lost in the dark for a long time and had just seen a light. Raylan had not let himself dwell on the silence between them over the past year. Not because he had stopped noticing, but because noticing had started to feel like standing at a locked door with no key. Every call he made went to voicemail. Every text received a short reply 2 days later. He had told himself she was busy, that she was building something with her husband, that she would reach out when she was ready. He had told himself that for long enough that it had become a habit of thought, easier than the alternative. Now the alternative was sitting in front of him. He looked at her coat, at the safety pin on Lila's jacket, at the way Tessa had folded her hands in her lap, perfectly still, a posture he recognized from when she was a teenager and had made a mistake and was waiting to find out how bad the consequences would be. She had always held herself that way when she felt she had failed at something, small and contained, as if taking up less space might reduce the damage. She had not failed at anything. He was certain of that even before he heard a single word of what had happened. He had been around long enough as a father, long enough as a man who had watched the world do things to people, to know the difference between someone who had broken down and someone who had been broken down. The first was a collapse from within. The second was something done to you, carefully and over time, by someone who understood exactly where the pressure points were. Tessa had the look of the second. He would stake his life on it. Raylan crossed the room. He sat down across from her, without making a scene, without reaching for her hand. He just looked at her quietly and steadily, the way he had always looked at her when things were bad, like he was not going anywhere. "When did you get here?" he asked. "2 days ago," she whispered. He glanced at the little girl sleeping against her shoulder. "That's Lila. I know who she is," he said. "She's grown." Tessa nodded. A tear slid down her cheek. She let it go without wiping it away. Raylan sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "Go get her things." The truck cab was warm. Raylan had the heater going full, and the vents were aimed at the back seat where Lila was still half asleep, wrapped in one of the blankets he had been about to donate. She had not made a sound when he carried her out. She had simply curled into his shoulder like she already knew him. Tessa sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap. She was looking straight ahead through the windshield at the gray street, at the traffic moving past in no particular hurry. Raylan gave her time. He did not push. He drove toward the east side of the city, toward home, and let the silence sit between them until she was ready to break it. "I didn't know where else to go," she said finally. He kept his eyes on the road. "You should have come sooner." She did not answer that. He had not expected her to. He had expected the silence. He had expected all of it in some broad, shapeless way, since the call started getting shorter and the visits stopped happening, and her voice took on that particular flatness that people develop when they are working hard not to say the real thing. He had not pressed. He had told himself it was not his place to press, that she was a grown woman, that he had to respect her choices, that inserting himself where he had not been invited would only push her further away. Now he sat in a truck with his daughter and his granddaughter and thought about what his restraint had cost. He set it aside. There was no use for it now. What mattered now was what came next. "Why were you at that shelter, Tess?" he asked. His tone was flat and even, not accusing, just direct. She pressed her fingers together in her lap. "He kicked us out." Raylan let a beat pass. "Evan." "Yes." "When?" "For days ago." She paused. "5. I lost track." He turned onto a quieter road. A dog barked somewhere behind a fence as they passed. "And the house," he said. "The one on Culver Road." She went still. "Tess." His voice was careful, but he was not going to leave this alone. "I gave that man the keys myself. I drove to Ashtabula with you. I watched you walk through the front door. What happened to it?" She turned to look out the passenger window. Outside, a snow-dusted yard passed slowly by. A rusted basketball hoop. A plastic sled leaning against a porch railing. "He said we never got it," she said. "What does that mean?" "He told me there were problems with the financing, that the deal fell through." She paused. "That was 2 years ago. He said we were renting after that. I never saw the paperwork. He handled all of it. He said I wouldn't understand the terms anyway." She stopped. Her jaw went tight. Raylan's grip tightened on the wheel, just slightly. He did not let it show in his voice. "And you believed him." It was not an accusation. It was a statement, flat, factual, and painful. "I believed everything he said," she said quietly. "For a long time, I believed all of it." He pulled onto his street and slowed as he approached the house. The front porch light was on. He had left it on that morning out of habit, the way he always had, even though there was no one to come home to anymore. He put the truck in park, but did not get out yet. "Tell me what happened," he said. She looked at her hands. "Not now," he said. "Tonight, when Lila's asleep." He turned to look at her for the first time since they had left the shelter. Really look at her. "But I need to hear it. All of it." She met his eyes. Hers were tired and red-rimmed. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something else. Something that had not quite been crushed yet. "Okay," she said. "Tonight." That night, After Lila had been fed a bowl of soup and tucked into the spare room under two of Raylan's good quilts, Tessa sat at the kitchen table. Raylan set a cup of tea in front of her and sat across from her with his own coffee. The house was quiet. The furnace ticked steadily in the basement. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pushing lightly against the kitchen window. Tessa wrapped both hands around the mug and stared into it for a moment. Then she began. Evan Cole had not started out the way he ended up. That was the thing she kept coming back to, even now. He had been careful, at first. Patient, even. He had been the kind of man who opened doors and remembered small details. The kind of coffee she liked, the fact that she hated overhead lighting, that her shoulders tensed when she was nervous. He had seemed like someone who paid attention to her in a way that no one else had. Someone who saw her. They had met at a conference her company ran in Cleveland. She was doing logistics. He was attending as a client representative. He was charming without being loud about it. He called when he said he would. He drove 3 hours to take her to dinner on a Tuesday night. He made her feel, for the first time in a long time, like she mattered to someone. They had dated for 8 months before he proposed. The proposal had been quiet. No crowd, no performance. He had taken her to a small restaurant she liked, a place with low lighting and good pasta, and he had placed a ring on the table between the breadbasket and the water glasses and said, simply, that he wanted to build something with her. She had cried. The good kind, then. She had thought, sitting across from him in that warm room, that she had finally found a man who was serious and stable and paying attention. She had thought she was lucky. Raylan had met him 4 times before the wedding. Each time, Evan had been attentive and prepared and exactly what you would want the man your daughter was going to marry to be. He asked the right questions. He was interested in the right things. He deferred to Tessa in conversation in a way that looked like respect. Raylan had shaken his hand at the reception and felt, for the first time in a long time, that his daughter was in good hands. That memory sat in him differently now. He had been wrong. Not carelessly wrong, not foolishly wrong. He had been wrong because Evan had been very good at constructing exactly what Raylan was looking for, and Raylan had looked for it and found it and stopped looking further. He would not make that kind of mistake again. But the knowledge of having made it once was its own particular weight, and he carried it quietly while Tessa talked. Raylan listened without expression. He kept his hand around his coffee mug and his eyes on her face, and he gave her nothing that would interrupt the telling. The first time something felt wrong, Tessa said, was about 4 months after the wedding. She had made plans to visit Raylan that weekend. A routine visit. She wanted to bring some photographs, talk about Thanksgiving. She had told Evan a week in advance. He had nodded and said it was fine. The morning she was going to leave, he sat down across from her at the breakfast table and said, very calmly, "I think you've been prioritizing your father over us." She had stared at him. "I'm going for 1 day." "It's a pattern," he said, like he had been thinking about it for a long time, like he had a list. "Every time something important is happening with us, you pull away. You run to your dad." She could not name a single time that had been true. But he said it with such certainty, such quiet conviction, that she had found herself reviewing her own memory for evidence she might have missed. She did not go that weekend. She told Raylan she was not feeling well. Raylan looked at his coffee mug. He remembered that call. He had believed her. The pattern that followed was slow. So slow that Tessa said she had not recognized it as a pattern at all for a long time. It felt like an endless series of individual moments, individual conversations, individual decisions, each one small enough to dismiss on its own. He began to check her phone. Not obviously. She would come back to her room and find it moved. She would pick it up and notice the browser open on something she had not been looking at. She brought it up once, carefully. He looked at her with that flat, patient expression and said, "I'm not going to apologize for being concerned about my wife." She stopped bringing it up. She described what came next the way you describe something you have had a long time to examine. Carefully, with the distance of someone who has finally been given permission to call it what it was. He had found, over the months that followed, a way of making her feel that her perception of events was not trustworthy. Not through outright denial. That would have been too obvious, but through a particular kind of revision. If she remembered something a certain way, he would remember it differently, and his version would always carry more certainty than hers. Over time, she had learned to check herself against his account before she trusted her own. She had learned to second-guess her own memory because his version was always delivered with such practiced assurance that questioning it felt like the unreasonable position to hold. Raylan recognized this. He had read about it years ago when a colleague's daughter had gone through something similar. At the time, he had filed it away as something that happened to other people. Now it was sitting across from him at his own kitchen table, wearing his daughter's face. He handled the money. That was the arrangement they had settled into, and she had not pushed back on it at the time because it had seemed reasonable. He worked in finance, she had never loved keeping accounts, and it freed up mental space. But over time, she realized she had no access to the main account. Her paycheck went in. She never saw the statements. He gave her a card with a limit on it, the way you would give a teenager an allowance. When she asked about their finances, about what they had saved, about the house they were supposedly going to buy, he would explain things in terms that felt designed to confuse her. The liquidity position is tied up in the equity restructure right now. She would nod, uncertain. He would say, "You don't need to worry about this. This is what I do." And there was always something in his tone that made her feel foolish for having asked. He was never loud about it. He never screamed. He never threatened. He was worse than that. He was consistent and quiet and relentlessly certain, and he had a way of framing every correction as a form of care. "You're too emotional to look at this clearly right now. I'm not criticizing you. I'm trying to help you understand. You'd fall apart without someone managing things." She described something else too, something she had trouble naming until she was well outside it. There had been a kind of grammar to the way Evan spoke to her. Not what he said, so much as the structure of it. He never raised his voice. He never made threats you could point to afterward and say, "There, that was the moment." He simply created the conditions in which certain conclusions became inevitable. You asked a question. He answered it in a way that made you feel the question had been foolish. You offered an opinion. He acknowledged it with a patience so deliberate it felt like correction. Over months and years, that grammar became the grammar of how she thought about herself. She had not noticed it happening. That was the thing she kept returning to in those first weeks at Raylan's kitchen table. Not the cruelty of it, but the invisibility. The way it had worked precisely because she could not see it working. Raylan listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer the analysis he was running quietly in his head, because this was not the moment for his thoughts. This was the moment for hers. After Lila was born, the control tightened further. The birth had been hard, and Tessa had gone through a difficult postpartum stretch. Not severe, but real. She had been tired and low and not herself for months. During that time, Evan had made himself indispensable in a way that looked like kindness from the outside. He took over more. He organized everything. He made every decision. And then he started reminding her of it. "I've been carrying this family. I don't know how you'd manage without me. You weren't doing well. Someone had to step up." By the time Lila was 2, Tessa had almost no contact with her own life. She had left her job. She rarely spoke to friends. Her visits with Raylan had become infrequent and always required negotiation. She had been reshaped over 4 years into someone who fit the space Evan had decided she should occupy, and she had not seen it happening because it had happened so gradually, so quietly, that each step had felt like her own choice. Then one afternoon she packed a bag to take Lila to the park, and Evan walked into the bedroom and said, "I need you to sign something." It was a document. She had not understood it fully, dense financial language, formatted in columns. She had asked what it was. "Just a restructuring of some accounts," he said. "It's routine." She had signed it. She did not know, until much later, what she had actually signed. The night he told her to get out, there was no screaming. He simply walked into the living room, stood in the doorway, and said, in a voice that carried no particular emotion, "I need you to leave. Take Lila. There's nothing here for you anymore." She had stood there for a moment, waiting for him to walk it back. He did not. He just looked at her with that flat patience he had perfected over years of quiet control. She packed what she could carry. She took Lila. She walked out. She had $43 in her wallet and no access to the bank account. Raylan sat still through all of it. He had not moved in 20 minutes. The coffee had gone cold in front of him. The furnace ticked. The window shivered faintly in the wind. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. He looked at her for a long moment. She was looking at her hands, her fingers pressed together on the table. She had the posture of someone bracing for a response, for judgment, for the question of why she had not left sooner, why she had not called, why she had let it go on so long. He did not ask any of those things. "You didn't fail," he said. "He spent 4 years making sure you couldn't see what was happening." She looked up. "That's not the same thing as failing," he said. "Not even close." She held it together for another few seconds. Then she put her face in her hands and let herself cry. Really cry, the ugly, ragged kind that she had clearly been holding back for a long time. Raylan did not get up, did not reach across the table, did not say anything more. He just sat there, steady, and let her. When it passed, she wiped her face with the heel of her hand and looked at him with something raw and exhausted and, underneath all of it, something beginning, something small and fragile that had not been completely killed. "I don't know where to start," she said. "I do," Raylan said. He picked up his coffee mug, looked at it, and set it back down. "We start with the house." Raylan drove to Ashtabula alone the next morning. He told Tessa he was going to handle some things and left early, before Lila woke up. He did not tell her where he was going yet, not until he knew what he was going to find. The drive from Erie took just under an hour on a clear day. The interstate was dry, the sky flat and white, the kind of January day that offered no weather but no warmth either. He drove with his hands loose on the wheel, the radio off. He was thinking. The house on Culver Road had been as close to a gift as he could manage. He had not been able to hand over cash, but he had known a man who was moving to Florida and willing to sell quickly at below market price. He had brokered the introduction. He had paid the inspection fee out of his own pocket and covered the first year of property taxes. He had driven with Tessa and Evan to Ashtabula on a Saturday in September 3 years ago, and he had stood in the driveway of that small blue house while they walked through it together. He had watched Evan shake the seller's hand. He had seen the paperwork signed at the title company's office on Main Street, in a room that smelled like printer toner and old carpet. He had handed Evan the keys himself in the parking lot, and Evan had put them in his pocket and said, "We'll take good care of it." Raylan had believed him. That thought sat in him differently now than it would have a week ago. A week ago, it might have come with the dull ache of a man who felt he had been played for a fool. Now it carried something colder and more useful. He had not simply been deceived. He had been managed, the same way Tessa had been managed, the same practice presentation, the same confident handshake, the same air of a man who knew what he was doing and expected others to defer to it. Evan had worn that air for Raylan the same way he had worn it for Tessa. As a tool, nothing more. And Raylan had responded the way most people responded to that kind of confidence. He had stepped back and let the man handle things. He would not be stepping back again. Now he turned off the highway onto Route 20 and followed it into the quiet streets of Ashtabula. The town was modest and unhurried, a mix of old Victorian houses and newer ranches, streets lined with bare maples, a water tower visible in the distance. He had always liked it out here. Tessa had seemed happy when she walked through that house. She had stood in the kitchen and said, "It smells like someone baked bread in here," and she had smiled. He found Culver Road and turned onto it. The blue house was still blue. The trim had been freshly painted white. Someone had been keeping it up. A newer mailbox stood at the end of the driveway. There was a truck parked in front, a dark green Ford with a contractor decal on the back window. A basketball hoop had been set up near the garage that had not been there before. Someone was living here. Someone who was not his daughter. He parked at the curb and sat for a moment, looking at it. Then he got out and walked up the front path. He knocked twice. Clean and firm, not loud. The door opened after a moment. A man stood in the doorway, late 30s, broad-shouldered, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled back. He had a confused but not unfriendly expression, the look of someone not expecting a visitor on a weekday morning. "Help you," the man said. Raylan looked at him steadily. "Is this the property at 4418 Culver Road?" "It is." "When did you move in?" The man's expression shifted slightly. Not hostile, just cautious. "About 7 months ago." "Why?" Raylan nodded once. "Where'd you purchase it?" "Private sale." The man's eyes narrowed a little now. Look, is there something I can help you with? Or I'm not here to cause you any trouble, Raylan said calmly. I need to know who you bought it from. The man studied him for a moment. Something in Raylan's stillness, the absence of aggression in it, seemed to decide it. Fella named Cole, he said. Evan Cole. We went through a private broker. Raylan asked the price. The man told him, $114,000. The house had appraised at just under $98,000 3 years ago. It had appreciated. Evan had waited, Raylan understood now, until the value climbed. Then he had sold it. Raylan thanked the man and walked back to his truck. He sat behind the wheel for a minute. The cold was very still around the truck. A crow landed on the basketball hoop at the end of the driveway and sat there, watching nothing in particular. Evan had not lost the house. He had not had bad luck with financing. He had not struggled. He had sold a house that did not belong to him and kept every dollar. Then he had kicked his wife and his daughter out into the street with nothing. Raylan started the truck. His expression had not changed. He pulled away from the curb and headed back toward Erie. He had a call to make. Evan Cole lived in a second-floor apartment in a newer building on the east side of the city. The kind of building with keypad entry and a gym on the ground floor and walls thin enough to hear your neighbor's television. Raylan had gotten the address from Tessa that morning before he left, asking casually, as though he just needed it for his records. He found the building without trouble and buzzed the unit from the lobby panel. The lobby smelled like recycled air and industrial cleaner. There was a decorative plant in the corner that looked almost real. The intercom crackled. Who is it? Raylan Pierce. A pause, longer than it needed to be. Then the door buzzed open. He took the stairs to the second floor and knocked on apartment 204. Evan answered after a moment. He was dressed well, clean jeans, a button-down shirt, hair neat. He looked like he had somewhere to be. His expression when he saw Raylan was not fear. It was the mild, impatient annoyance of someone who considered this an inconvenience and not a reckoning. Oh, it's you. Raylan said nothing. He stepped forward, and Evan, apparently to his own surprise, stepped back, and Raylan walked into the apartment without being invited. The place was clean and furnished in that impersonal way that suggested everything had been selected from the same store on the same afternoon. A large television on the wall, a leather couch, a kitchen counter with a bottle of whiskey and a glass on it, though it was not yet 11 in the morning. On the coffee table, a half-eaten plate of toast and an open laptop. Raylan stood in the middle of the room and looked at Evan. You sold a house, Raylan said. Evan closed the apartment door behind him and crossed his arms. What house? Don't do that. Raylan's voice was quiet. Flat. The house on Culver Road. You sold it 7 months ago for $114,000. It was in my name, Evans said. No, Raylan said. It wasn't. Something moved across Evan's face then. Quick and subtle. A recalculation happening behind his eyes. Your daughter signed it over to me, he said. She agreed to everything. She knew exactly what was happening. Raylan looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Evan held his gaze, but the steadiness had gone out of it. He was working behind the eyes, assembling a position, checking his exits. Tessa didn't sign anything, Raylan said. She did. Evan's voice was smooth. Practiced. She signed a property agreement. I can show you the document. You can show me whatever you want, Raylan said. I'm going to have a lawyer look at every piece of paper attached to that property, including the title transfer, including the deed. He paused, especially the signatures. Evan's jaw tightened. I'm also going to pull the financial records, Raylan continued. Every account she contributed to, every paycheck that went into a joint account she couldn't access, every statement from the day you were married. You don't have standing to do any of that. She does, Raylan said, and she's asking. Evan looked at him for a long moment. Then he shifted, uncrossed his arms, and put his hands in his pockets. A deliberate move, relaxed, measured, in control. Raylan watched it and recognized it for exactly what it was. She agreed to everything, Evan said again. She was aware of the financial arrangements. You told her she wouldn't understand them, Raylan said. And then you made sure she didn't. I managed our household. That's what I did. If she chose not to be involved, she didn't choose, Raylan said. You chose for her. Every time. Evan looked at him with that flat, patient expression Tessa had described, the one that said he was very certain and could wait you out. This is going to go badly for you, Evan said. If she pursues this. Raylan picked up his jacket from the arm of the couch and turned to go. Raylan. Evan's voice followed him to the door. He stopped, turned. She can't afford a lawyer, Evan said. The words were meant to land, to remind Raylan of who held the money and how these things usually ended. Raylan looked at him. She doesn't need to afford one, Raylan said. I've got a daughter who was defrauded. A lawyer will take that case on contingency before the week is out. He walked out. He took the stairs back down and crossed the parking lot to his truck. He sat behind the wheel for 30 seconds, long enough to let the composure settle back into place, long enough to let the cold fury behind it go where he needed it to go. Then he took out his phone and called his attorney. Her name was Diane Marsh. He had used her for the sale of his own house 3 years ago, and again when he had sorted out his wife's estate. She was methodical and direct, and did not take cases she did not think she could win. He told her, in plain terms, what he had found. He told her about the house, the sale price, the buyer, the date. He told her what Tessa had said about the financial arrangements, about the account access, about the document she had been asked to sign without understanding. He told her everything in the order it had happened, leaving nothing out and adding nothing. Diane said she needed to see the title records. She said they would need Tessa's authorization to pull financial documents. She said the word forgery once, quietly, as a possibility to be confirmed rather than a conclusion, and then she said she would call him back that afternoon. Raylan thanked her and sat in the parking lot for another moment, watching the traffic on the street in front of the building. Then he started the truck and drove home. 2 evenings later, Raylan sat across from Tessa at the kitchen table again. This time the table had papers on it. A manila folder sat open between them, and inside it were printed copies, the original title documents from the Culver Road sale obtained through the county recorder's office, a brief from his attorney, and a handwritten timeline Raylan had put together himself over the past 36 hours. Tessa looked at the folder, but did not open it. I went to the house, Raylan said. Someone else lives there. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them. He sold it, she said. It was not a question. For about $16,000 more than it was worth when we got it, Raylan said. He waited until the value went up. She pressed her lips together. He planned this, she said, very quietly. Yes. She looked at the folder. She did not reach for it yet. Her hands were flat on the table, and Raylan watched the muscles in her jaw work as she processed it. He told me we couldn't afford the mortgage, she said. For 2 years, he told me things were tight, that we had setbacks. I cut back on everything. I stopped buying things for myself. I sold my car and started taking the bus. She paused. He was sitting on $100,000 the whole time. Raylan let that sit without comment. I thought I had no rights to anything, she said. He made sure I believed that. Raylan placed a second sheet on the table between them. It was a 1-page summary his attorney had prepared, a clear, plain-language list of Tessa's legal standing, her right to marital assets, her right to documentation, her right to pursue fraud. She read it slowly. Then she read it again. You always had rights, Raylan said. He just made sure you never believed it. She looked up from the page. Her eyes were steady, tired, still, but not fragile. Not anymore. He told me I was the reason everything failed, she said. Her voice was level. He said it so many times I stopped arguing with it. He said it because it was useful, Raylan said. Not because it was true. She was quiet for a moment. Then she set the paper down and looked at her hands. He called me worthless, she said. Not once. 100 times. In 100 different ways. Raylan met her eyes across the table. He did not flinch from it and did not soften it. Then prove him wrong, he said. The words were not soft. They were not meant to comfort. They were a direction. She held his gaze. Something moved in her face. Not warmth exactly, but the beginning of something hard and focused. The look of someone deciding. What do I need to do, she said. First, you sign authorization for the attorney to request your financial records. Joint accounts, property accounts, anything your name was on. He tapped the folder. Then we wait for what comes back. She reached across the table and pulled the folder toward her. She opened it. She picked up the pen he had left beside it, and she signed. The financial records came back within 8 days. Raylan's attorney, a quiet woman named Diane Marsh who had practiced civil and family law in Erie for 22 years, laid everything out on the conference table in her office on a gray Wednesday morning. She had a habit of presenting things without drama, just facts, in order, with a brief explanation of what each one meant. Raylan appreciated that about her. Tessa sat beside him. She had started coming to the appointments herself, and she had changed over the past 2 weeks in a way that was hard to name precisely. She asked questions now. She wrote things down in a small notebook she had bought at the drugstore. The nervous hesitation that had marked her posture in those first days at the kitchen table was still there in traces, but something else had moved in alongside it. Something steadier. Diane placed a document on the table and let them look at it for a moment without speaking. "This is the property transfer deed for 4418 Culver Road," she said. "Filed with the Ashtabula County Recorder's Office 16 months ago." Raylan looked at it. Tessa looked at it. There on the signature line for the second co-owner was a signature. Tessa's name, written in a fluid and confident hand. Tessa stared at it. She shook her head slowly. "That's not my signature," she said. Her own signature was something she had been writing since she was a teenager, a specific, looping T that curved before settling into the other letters, with a particular hook at the bottom of the final letter that she had never changed. She knew it the way she knew her own face. What was on that document was not it. The letters were shaped correctly enough to pass a quick glance. But the angle was wrong, the weight of the pen strokes was wrong, and that final hook was absent entirely. "I never signed this," she said. Not angry, just absolutely certain. Diane nodded. "That's what we suspected. I've already sent copies to a forensic document examiner. We'll have the full comparison report within 2 weeks." She paused. "But there's something else. The county recorder has confirmed the notarization on this document was performed by a notary whose license had lapsed 14 months before the filing date." Raylan looked at Diane. "A notarized document with a lapsed notary," Diane said, "is not legally valid, which means this transfer was fraudulent from the moment it was filed." The room was very quiet. "What does that mean for Evan?" Tessa asked. "It means the property sale may be voidable," Diane said. "That's complicated because the buyer acted in good faith, so we'll have to work through that separately. But for Evan Cole, it means we are now looking at forgery." She set another page on the table. "We're also looking at fraud, financial abuse within the marriage, and depending on what the examiner confirms and what the DA decides, potentially wire fraud, given that the sale proceeds passed through a bank account." Tessa looked at the document with Evan's name on it, his neat, ordinary name on a piece of paper that had cost her 4 years of her life. "How long has he known this could come back on him?" she asked. Diane tapped her pen against the table once. "He knew the moment he filed it. He was counting on you never finding out, or on you never having the resources to pursue it if you did." Tessa folded her hands on the table. "Send everything to the DA," she said. Raylan looked at her. "All of it," Tessa said. "The forgery, the fraud, the financial records. Everything." She paused. "He made his choices. Now he can answer for them." The arrest happened on a Thursday morning. Raylan was not there when it happened. He found out through Diane, who called him at 9:30 with a brief and professional delivery. The DA's office had moved that morning. Evan had been taken into custody at his apartment, and the charges included forgery, fraud, and financial abuse. Raylan thanked her and ended the call. He stood in his kitchen for a moment, holding the phone. Then he set it down on the counter and went back to making coffee. He found out the details later that afternoon, when a detective named Okafor came to the house to complete Tessa's witness statement. Okafor was a compact, methodical man who moved through the house with professional courtesy. He sat across from Tessa at the coffee table, put his notepad on his knee, and went through the questions one by one while Lila played with a set of wooden blocks in the next room. When a statement was done, Okafor told them, in a matter-of-fact tone of someone who had delivered this kind of information many times, what had happened at Evan's apartment that morning. Evan had opened the door when they knocked. He was already dressed, as though ready to go somewhere. When a detective introduced himself and informed Evan of the charges, Evan had smiled. That was what Okafor said. He smiled, the way you smile when you believe you are about to be proved right about something. There must be a misunderstanding, Evan had said. My wife signed everything. It was all consensual. Okafor had told him the forensic examiner had confirmed the signature was forged. The smile went away. Then Evan tried something else. He explained. He laid out the arrangement. How Tessa had not been well. How he had been managing everything out of necessity. How the property decision had been a mutual one in spirit, even if the paperwork had not reflected it. How she had been aware of the general terms. He spoke with the fluency and confidence of a man who had spent years explaining things to people who had no choice but to listen. The detective let him finish. Then Okafor produced the forensic report, the notary records, and the financial documentation showing a transfer of $114,000 to an account held solely in Evan's name. The money had been used over the following months for personal expenses and private investments, none of which had been disclosed to Tessa. Evan said she agreed to everything. Okafor said, "Sir, we have the evidence." He tried one more thing. He looked at the detective and said, "Call my wife. She'll tell you." She understood the situation. Okafor said, simply, "She's the one who filed the complaint." That landed. Okafor said it was the first moment Evan's composure actually broke. Not into fear, not into remorse, but into something cold and directed. He looked past the detective and said, to no one in particular, "This is her doing," as if the exposure of a crime were somehow the greater offense than the crime itself. They put the handcuffs on him in the hallway of his apartment. Okafor mentioned that Evan walked through the arrest with his chin up. Not admiringly, just factually. Evan Cole walked out of his apartment and into a patrol car with the posture of someone who had not yet fully accepted that the ground beneath him had shifted. Back at the house, Tessa listened to Okafor's account with a stillness that Raylan recognized. When the detective finished, she thanked him for coming and walked him to the door. When she came back down the hallway, she paused for a moment with her hand on the wall. From the living room came the small, careful sounds of Lila stacking her blocks. From the kitchen came the smell of the soup Raylan had started before Okafor arrived. She stayed still for a count of 10. Then she straightened and walked in to sit with her daughter. Raylan stayed in the kitchen. He stirred the soup, turned the heat down a notch, set 2 bowls and a smaller one for Lila on the counter. He kept his movements deliberate and quiet, because quiet was what the house needed right now. Tessa had handled the afternoon with more composure than most people could manage on an easy day, and the last thing she needed was to have to tend to his response on top of her own. His response was his to carry, and what he felt, if he was honest about it, was not satisfaction. Satisfaction was too clean a word for what this was. It was more like the particular stillness that comes after you have done something difficult and necessary, and there is no longer any question of whether it needed doing. The question had been answered. The uncertainty was gone. What remained was the work and the bare, serious ground of what came next. He put the ladle back on the rest and listened to the sounds from the living room. The small knock of wooden blocks, Lila's running narration, Tessa's occasional quiet response. Normal sounds. An evening at home. He stood there a moment just listening to them. Then he got out the bread, cut it, and put on the table. The courtroom in Erie was a quiet room. The kind of quiet that comes not from calm, but from weight, from all the things that have been decided here over many years. The ceilings were high and the light was fluorescent, and the wooden benches along the gallery had been worn smooth by all the people who had sat in them waiting for things to be determined. Tessa sat at the petitioner's table with Diane Marsh beside her. She sat straight, both feet on the floor, both hands folded in front of her on the table. She was wearing a navy jacket she had found at the thrift store and altered herself the previous week. Her hair was pinned back. She looked like someone who had come prepared, which she had. Evan sat at the respondent's table across the room with his attorney, a man named Greer who had a reputation for aggressive representation and who had been working for weeks to build the case that Tessa had been a full participant in every financial decision, that the property transfer had been consensual, that the fraud charge was the product of a disgruntled spouse manufacturing grievances after the marriage collapsed. It had been, by all accounts, a thorough effort. It had also run directly into the forensic document examiner's report, the notary certification failure, the financial records, and Tessa's testimony, all of which Diane had presented with the same quiet precision she brought to everything she did. Raylan sat in the front row of the gallery. He had dressed in his good clothes, dark slacks, a wool tie he had not worn since his wife's funeral, a jacket with no scuffs on it. He sat with his hands on his knees and watched. He watched Tessa listen as the judge reviewed the findings. He watched Evan's attorney make his arguments, smooth, rehearsed, and carefully framed. He watched Tessa's face as she listened to those arguments, the ones that called her confused, manipulated, and unstable, the ones that dressed up 4 years of deliberate control as reasonable household management. She listened to all of it with a stillness that Raylan recognized, because it was the same stillness he had taught himself over 20 years of difficult work. It was not numbness. It was decision. It was the face of someone who had already concluded that the outcome did not depend on how she felt about what was being said. When it was Tessa's turn to speak, she did so without notes. She described the financial arrangement, the controlled access, the withheld information, the document she had been told was routine. She described the 4 years of incremental erosion. She described waking up in a shelter in January with $43 and a 4-year-old child. She described it all plainly, without embellishment, without visible emotion. Not because she felt nothing, but because she had decided weeks earlier that this was not the place for feeling. This was the place for fact. Greer pushed back on cross-examination. Isn't it true that you had access to the household bank account? I had access to a secondary card with a spending limit, Tessa said. I did not have login credentials for the primary account. I never received statements. But you agreed to that arrangement. I was told that was how things were done. I was not given an alternative. In the property document, you testified you never signed it. I never signed it. Yet your name appears. My name appears on a document signed by someone who was not me, notarized by a notary whose license had lapsed over a year before the filing date. She met his eyes without any particular effort. The forensic examiner confirmed the signature is not mine. The county recorder confirmed the notarization is invalid. If you have a question about the evidence, I'm happy to wait while you review it. Greer paused. He moved on. It had gone on like that for the better part of an hour. Greer was methodical and skilled, and he worked the questions in rotating angles, returning to the same points from different directions, hoping to catch a seam in Tessa's account, a hesitation he could pull at. He did not find one. Tessa answered each question with the same level directness. She did not elaborate beyond what was asked. She did not let herself be drawn into speculation. She had, Raylan understood, prepared for this, not just with Diane's help, but on her own, in the evenings at the kitchen table, working through the questions she expected, finding the cleanest and most precise answer to each one. She had approached this the way she had approached everything in the past 2 months, as a problem with a solution, and as someone who intended to be the one who solved it. When the judge spoke, he used the measured language of the court, but the substance was plain. The fraud charges against Evan Cole were proceeding in criminal court. The evidence of financial abuse within the marriage was clear and documented. The property transfer was deemed fraudulent and referred back to civil proceedings for resolution. As to the divorce, granted. As to custody of Lila, full physical and legal custody to Tessa, with supervised visitation for Evan pending resolution of the criminal charges. Evan looked at Tessa from across the room when the judge finished speaking. He held the look for a moment. It was the look of a man trying to communicate something without words, trying to say that this was not over, that he was not diminished, that she had not won as completely as she believed. Tessa gave him nothing, not contempt, not satisfaction, not sadness. She simply stopped looking at him. She turned back to the table and gathered her papers, and she did not look at him again. Because there was, as she had known for several weeks, nothing left to give him. Not anger, not grief, not even the attention he had always treated as something he was owed. He had taken everything he was going to take from her. That account was closed. She stood up. She shook Diane's hand. She picked up her folder, and she walked out. Spring came late to northern Ohio that year, arriving in fits and starts. A warm week in March followed by a hard cold snap, then rain through most of April, And then suddenly a morning in early May when the light came through the windows at a different angle and the mud in the yard had gone to grass and the air outside smelled like wet earth and something green. The house on Culver Road had a complicated legal history now. The civil proceedings had been lengthy and had required more of Raylan's time and Diane's patience than any of them had fully anticipated. The good faith buyer had been fairly compensated through a settlement that drew partly on the proceeds from Evan's frozen financial accounts. The house had been returned to Tessa's name. Clean, clear, formally and permanently hers. She had driven out to see it for the first time the previous week, alone, while Lila was with Raylan. She had stood in the driveway for a long moment, just looking. The trim was fresh. The gutters were clear. Someone had planted small shrubs along the front path that had taken root and leafed out nicely. She had walked through the whole house by herself. She had stood in the kitchen, in the doorway of what would be Lila's room, on the back porch looking out at the small yard. She had not cried. She had just looked at it, measured it, understood it, claimed it back in some quiet internal way that did not require witnesses. Now, it was a Saturday morning in May, and they were all there together. Lila ran through the backyard with total commitment, the way children run, as if speed is the point and there is no destination, just the joy of legs moving fast and grass underfoot. She had found a stick somewhere and was carrying it like a staff, narrating something to herself in the half-coherent running commentary that 4-year-olds maintain as a matter of course. She was wearing yellow rain boots that matched nothing else she had on, and she was entirely indifferent to this. Tessa stood on the back porch. Her coffee was in her hand, going slowly cold while she watched Lila run. The morning light was good, pale, and even, the kind that made the yard look clean even before the season had fully arrived. There was work to do. The back fence needed repair. A section of the porch railing had softened and would need replacing before summer. She had a list. She had started making lists again, practical ones, with timelines and priorities, and each time she added something to one, she felt the faint, steady satisfaction of a person who is moving in a known direction. At the far end of the yard, Raylan was crouched beside the fence with a post-hole digger and a bag of cement mix. He had arrived that morning before 8, in his work clothes, with his truck bed loaded with supplies. He had not made an announcement about it. He had simply pulled up, gotten out, nodded at Tessa on the porch, and gone around back to start work. He worked the way he always worked, steady and efficient, with no wasted movement. He dug each hole to the right depth, mixed the cement in the small bucket he had brought, set the new post, and checked it with a level before moving to the next one. He had done fencing before, on his own property and his father's before that. He knew exactly how it was supposed to go. Lila ran past him at one point and stopped, watching with deep seriousness as he tamped down the earth around the base of the post. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Fixing the fence," he said. She considered this for a moment. "Why is it broken?" "Things get loose over time," he said. "You fix them." She accepted this with a solemn nod and ran off again. Tessa watched from a porch. She finished her coffee and set the mug down on the railing and crossed the yard toward him. She stood beside him for a moment, watching him set the level against the new post. "You didn't have to come today," she said. "I know," he said. He adjusted the post a fraction of an inch and checked it again. She looked down the fence line. "There are 4 more sections." "I've got time," he said. She was quiet. A robin moved in the oak tree at the corner of the property, fat and purposeful, pulling something from the soft ground near the roots. "I stayed too long," Tessa said. Her voice was even. She was not asking for absolution. She was stating a fact, the way you state a fact when you have finally made peace with it, when the weight of it has shifted from something that crushes you to something you simply carry and understand. Raylan looked up at her. He held her eyes for a moment. "But you left," he said. She nodded slowly. He did not add anything to it. He did not soften it or stretch into a speech about how brave she had been. He just let it stand as what it was, the truth, and the most important part of it. She stood there with him for a moment longer. The morning was bright and still around them. Lila had circled back and was crouching near the tree, examining something on the ground with complete absorption. An ant, a stone, nothing at all, did not matter. She was there. She was safe. Tessa looked at her daughter, then at the yard, with the new fence post standing straight and clean at the far end. Then at the house itself, standing solid and blue behind her, the white trim bright in the morning light. Something moved through her. Not joy exactly. Joy was too light a word for it. It was heavier than that and more solid. It was the feeling of ground under her feet after a long time of not having any. The feeling of knowing exactly where she stood and knowing that no one was going to move her from it. For the first time in years, she felt safe. Not because the world had become gentle, and not because the past had been erased, but because she had fought for this yard in this house, and this ordinary morning with her daughter in yellow rain boots, and her father fixing a fence that had been left to fall apart too long. She had fought for it, and she had won it, and it was hers. She thought, standing there, about the version of herself who had sat in that shelter 2 days before she called the hospital because she was not sure her coat was warm enough for Lila, and she could not afford another one. That woman had believed, with a quiet and devastating certainty, that this was what she deserved. Not the shelter, exactly, not consciously, but the smallness of it, the reduced options, the feeling that the decisions had all been made and all she could do was move within whatever was left. For years of that grammar had done its work on her. She had not seen it doing the work, but she had felt, in those first days at her father's kitchen table, what it felt like when it stopped. It felt like the first full breath after a long time of shallow ones. Evan Cole entered a guilty plea on the forgery charge 6 months later, avoiding a trial, but not the consequences. Between the criminal proceeding and the civil settlement, he lost the money, the freedom of his schedule, and the careful architecture of a life he had built. He lost the control he had spent years mistaking for strength. He lost everything he thought he controlled. There was a period in the weeks after the criminal proceedings concluded when people asked Tessa how she felt about it. They expected, she thought, a particular kind of answer. Relief, vindication, maybe some version of forgiveness packaged for public consumption. She did not give them any of those things, because none of them were precisely true. What she felt was simpler and less dramatic than any of it. She felt finished with him. Not in anger, not in triumph, just finished, the way you were finished with a task that required more of you than it should have, and that you were glad is done. She had given Evan Cole 4 years of her life and a great deal of herself. He had spent those resources badly. She was not going to spend any more on having feelings about it. She had Lila. She had the house. She had her father and the fence he had repaired and the list on her kitchen counter with the things that needed doing. She had work that was hers and mornings that belonged to no one else's agenda. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything she had wanted when she was 26 and standing in the parking lot of the title company in Ashtabula, watching a man she trusted put a key in his pocket. She had gotten it back, on her terms, through her own willingness to stand up and say, "This is what happened. Here is the evidence, and I'm not leaving until it is dealt with." That was enough, more than enough. And Tessa Pierce, who had left a shelter in January with $43 and a child and a coat that was too thin for the cold, stood in her own yard on a morning in May and watched her daughter run, and built her life from what was real.